Hello, and welcome to Sunnyside Nursery. I'm Houseplant Holly, and today we're going to be filming in our houseplant department for our Happy Houseplant class. Today I'll be going over a few things to keep in mind before you go out plant shopping, since it can be kind of overwhelming for the novice houseplant parent, and then also talk about basic care tips such as lighting and watering, fertilizing, aerating, all that kind of stuff. So great tips for all sorts of plant parents. So let's get to it. Before going plant shopping, you want to make sure that you know what kind of plants will thrive in your space. What direction does the light come from? Is it a window? Is it a skylight? Is it a grow light, or a combo of both? What kind of care are you willing to give your plant? Like, are you really busy and you want something that you can kind of like not fuss over? If you miss a watering, it's not going to be a diva and drop all its leaves. Or do you want to nurture something a little bit more? Also, there's what's your budget? There are many plants that are budget conscious, that are easy to care for and great to start with, but they're not kind of run-of-the-mill like you see everywhere. We do have like quite a bit of variety here. And then a big question that we are asked often here is, what is pet friendly? There are many non-toxic pet friendly options that we carry, but when you're out shopping in the world, you want to make sure that you're truly buying a non-toxic plant for your little nibbler critters. This is where botanical names are really important. There are many common names for multiple genera of plants, so you want to make sure that you are really buying like what you want. They may be hard to pronounce, which is fine, but if you have it written down or alongside a photo, that's not a problem. We can help you out. There's also a lot of misinformation online, so you want to make sure you're getting your info from reputable sources. Websites like the ASPCA or horticultural sites from different universities or current houseplant books are really great sources to get a lot of that good information. It's also a good idea to cross-reference the information that you find to really make sure that your critters at home are safe.
A good example why botanical names are so important is because common names can get confusing and describe different types of plants. For instance, these three plants' common name is baby tears, when actually this is a pilea, this is a peperomia, and then this here is a solorolia. Fortunately that these three are pet friendly, so that's a win, but when you're talking about a non-toxic plant versus a toxic plant that share the same common name or something really similar, that's why botanical names are so important.
When you buy a new plant, it's always good to acclimate it away from your existing plants for at least a week. I know this can be difficult when you have limited space and light, but it really should be done. There could be a dormant pest hiding that can emerge later on, and you don't want the rest of your plants to be possibly subjected. Your plant will also begin to acclimate to your growing conditions, so your temperature, your watering schedule. It will receive less light than at a growing facility or a greenhouse or nursery. So your plant may take up to 2 weeks to show some sort of growth or some sort of decline possibly in that time. If you do see active, happy growth, then I suggest keeping it in that spot. But if the plant begins to suffer, then you may need to move the plant to another spot or check on some other factors such as if it has pests or some watering issues. Okay, so lighting is going to be the most important thing to provide when owning houseplants. The good thing to remember is light equals food. So if you shove your plant in a dark corner or with an area with zero light, it will eventually starve to death. No plants can grow in darkness. You will need to provide natural light from windows or skylights or grow lights or a combo of both. Something to remember is that these plants grow in very bright, warm climates outside, so it's best to try and mimic the conditions as best as possible. When knowing what direction the light comes into your home will be very important.
determining which plants will thrive in your space. Something to keep in mind is also, is there any buildings blocking the light coming into your home, such as trees or a big fence, a big shrub, or buildings right next door? So those are all things that just to keep in mind when you are selecting plants for your home. So directional light, north facing will be the lowest light area in your home. Some plants may do okay or may end up surviving but not thriving. So you really want to put that plant in that window when it has to do with north facing light. So east facing light will be between low and medium light. So direct sunlight that comes in the morning from this direction will be okay for all plants since the light is not as intense as south or west facing. But again, you'll want to put that plant as close to the window or in the window as best as possible, just so your plant is getting enough light throughout the day. So now with south and west will be the most intense and high light. This bright indirect light is best light for most indoor plants. Bright indirect light refers to placing your plant out of like the direct sun path of that intense sun path coming in through your window that's being magnified, but you really want to put it in the brightest spot possible. So that's bright indirect light. Some plants will not do well in direct light and will end up bleaching or burning the leaves if it's too intense, but things like little succulents or little cacti will do fine in that bright direct light. So a few light tips to remember are, one, you want to make sure that you're going to be like rotating your plants every couple of weeks. Since your plants are going to be growing into the direction of the light, they're going to kind of want to grow in one direction. So if you want to keep really good even growth, you'll want to kind of just spin that plant and then allow the growth to kind of reorient itself to be kind of more even. Number two is you want to make sure that you're wiping your leaves down at least once a month to get dirt and dust off. You can use just like a damp cloth, which is water. You can use some insecticidal soap if you know you're just really wanting to give your plants a really good clean top and bottom. And then three is don't move your plants once they're situated in a happy spot. Don't think like, oh, I have a plant that's way off in a dark corner and I feel bad, so I'm going to switch it for this one that's doing really happy in a bright area and then give it more food. So what you just did to this plant that was happy is now you're starving this plant and then giving this plant its food. So you should try to find space where they're both going to be happy in the same area.
All right, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is watering. And watering can be challenging at first, but once you get into a groove and a good schedule, it will be easier. The first thing you want to do is check the moisture of your soil before watering. Most plants like to dry out about an inch or two, depending on how big the pot is and how mature the plant is, before watering again. And especially if it's in a low light area, you will want to water less. So creating a weekly schedule to commit to is a really good idea. Not necessarily watering every week, but at least checking the soil. So a good way to check the soil is just to use your fingers and test the soil. So you just want to really put your finger way down in there, about an inch or two, and see how much moisture is actually in there. And then this will determine on if you need to water or not. So I'm really not a big fan of moisture meters so you won't really know firsthand what the moisture is like unless you have a really deep pot or short fingers. But I always think it's best to kind of really know like what's going on with your plant and just kind of do a field test and get into that groove. So you can also use a non-treated chopstick or a little skewer or something like that and plunge it down into a bigger pot wherever, making a huge mess, and wherever your moisture will kind of wick into that wood, and then you can kind of tell that way wherever it's been plunged. All right, when it's time to water, it's good to water thoroughly using lukewarm water. You can use some cool water if you're kind of in a rush, but it is kind of best to use some nice room temperature water. You know, your plant is all nice and cozy and, you know, in the environment, and then if you put cold water on it, it can be a little bit of a shock, but it won't necessarily hurt the plant. But you don't want to use like ice water, ice cubes, or anything like that, because that's just too much of a shock. And if you use water that's too hot, you can actually damage the plant. Hot water, especially like boiling water, will explode the cells and actually kill your plant. So you really want to make sure like you're going for that lukewarm room temp, maybe a little cooler water temperature. And then also when you're watering thoroughly is when you completely saturate the soil and you see the water coming out of the drainage holes at the bottom. The weight will also increase with the plant as well. So you really want to make sure that you're going to be watering all around the roots. You're not just going to water at the base of the plant. I mean, the roots aren't just underneath this plant. They stretch out all around the pot. So you really want to make sure that you are watering all the soil here. And you want to make sure that you are getting it really good. You know, it may bubble up a little bit, but you really want to make sure that you are watering thoroughly enough where you do see water coming out of the bottom of your plant like this. A little bit more, and you will. So the weight definitely has increased more in this pot just for that amount of water. So that's definitely where you want to be when you are thoroughly watering your plant. I'm just going to water this guy one more time just so you can kind of see here, even though it definitely is very saturated at this point. You can see that I'm like getting water all around that pot and then allowing this to really drain through. Now you don't want it to sit in water like this once it's been thoroughly watered. You'll want to make sure, like if it is in a saucer or if it is in like a cache pot, you do dump that water out so it's not sitting in that water all the time. If when you water and the water immediately runs straight through the pot and the soil has completely dried out, you can kind of see that the soil is starting to pull away from the pot a little bit more. It's really kind of dry and crumbly. So when you do water this plant, the water is going to go completely straight through here and it's not going to be absorbed into the soil. You can also kind of see that the plant is a little wilted. Don't worry, this was in the name of science. This will perk up and be just fine. So don't worry about it. This is not one of those diva plants where if you forget about it, it's gonna drop all its leaves and be super sad. So really good way to reconstitute this soil is, so when you do top water, let's see if I can show you this. You can see how it just runs completely through. It's not even stopping to even say hi and get absorbed into that soil. It's just going to be completely. So you can kind of see here, you can see at the bottom here, there's not even any water coming through the center of the plant. It's just getting a little bit wet, but it's not actually absorbing anything. So a really good thing to do if that happens is, so if you do top water it, like so, and then you keep it in a little dish or saucer or a little bowl or something like that, you want to make sure that the bottom of the pot will be sitting in the water a little bit more. And so you just kind of want to let it sit here for maybe an hour. This is a 2-inch pot, so you know it doesn't have a lot of soil, so it will absorb it pretty quickly. You know, kind of give it a little bit of a pinch here, and then just let it reabsorb
that water. And then this plant will definitely perk up once the soil is all nice and saturated, and then it will get all nice into the leaves. So a good schedule to check your plants, it would be a weekly schedule is great. Every plant will dry out kind of at its own different intervals, but it's always good to have a good schedule as a weekly schedule, checking soil, checking leaves, checking how your plant's doing, if it's thriving or just surviving. So a good watering schedule or good plant schedule is going to be really key. And some people just have a lot going on. I understand, plants kind of become last before all the other priorities in your life. But it's a really good to maybe set a reminder on your phone or write it on a calendar if you physically want to write it down, and really remind yourself like, hey, I really want to be a better plant parent, so I'm just going to set myself some really good reminders. Now, there are a few different signs that plants will show you when they are getting really thirsty. It's kind of takes the guesswork out of some of the plants when you are new at being a plant parent. One of the main ones you will see is when a plant is starting to wilt, kind of like this. And some plants will wilt a little bit more dramatically, like a peace lily. They're pretty dramatic when they get really thirsty, but they will perk up with some water. They just love water so much. So wilting is definitely one of the most key signs of thirst. Now, if your plant is soaking wet, like it's really wet and it is wilting then you're possibly going to be running into a root rot. So you really want to make sure if your soil is completely saturated and your plant is wilting, it has too much water. So you really want to make sure that that dries out, and hopefully you haven't done any permanent damage to the plant. Now, another one that's kind of common, especially in the Calathea family, is when the leaves start to roll up like this. This one's starting to get a little bit thirsty, and you can kind of see how these leaves are starting to curl in a little bit more. That's definitely a sign of it's getting pretty thirsty, so it's time for good water. Another sign would be the wrinkling of the leaves. I don't really have a good example of that, but especially in your thicker leafed plants like peperomias, definitely succulents, when their leaves really start to wrinkle, they're losing a lot of that water that they have stored in there. So that's definitely a sign that they're getting thirsty. And then another one, which I unfortunately don't have a good example of, is the color in the foliage will change. So I've definitely seen this in like ferns and spider plants, where the vibrancy of the leaves really get really drab and washed out looking. So instead of like a spider plant being a nice vibrant green and white, that green really gets to like a drabby sagey green color. So those are definitely some different signs that your plants will tell you, hey, I'm thirsty, let's get some water in me. But again, so even if your leaves are showing you signs of they're thirsty, you definitely want to make sure that you are checking that soil first before you're watering, because that is definitely going to be telling you, yes, I truly am dry and I totally need a drink right now. Another thing to keep in mind is where you will be putting your plants in your home in regards to them losing moisture. So when plants are close to fireplaces or air conditioners, heat vents, or even hanging up higher or sitting high up on a shelf, they will dry out faster. So that's another thing that you'll just need to kind of remember, like, hey, if these are in a really drafty area, that will dry them out faster. Just be more aware of that's happening. All right, so let's talk a little bit about humidity. Humidity is something that not all plants require, but a lot of the foliage plants would actually prefer a little bit of a boost. They definitely can acclimate to a 30% humidity, but they might not be
super stoked about that. So it's good to maybe try a couple things to kind of increase the localized humidity around your plants, but not necessarily your entire house. So a good way to increase humidity is to group plants together, kind of like this. So plants have what are called stomata in their leaves, which act like pores and release vapor out. So it's kind of like plant sweat in a way. So when that is released, it does create kind of a little humidity area when they are all kind of sharing that space. Also, another way to increase kind of maybe just around like one plant or a couple plants that you are kind of grouping together, but you really want to increase that localized humidity is, so I have a little dish here with some rocks. You can use some other smaller stones if you want as well. And so what you would do is you kind of just place your plant kind of on top of it, and you want to put a little bit of water at the base of this, not necessarily where your plant is sitting in water. That's why you have that rock barrier in between the water and your plant. So once this water will evaporate, it will kind of evaporate around the plant, kind of creating that little like eco zone here. And then your plant will get nice and happy with that humidity. Another way to increase humidity is by a humidifier. I know this can be sometimes a chore or an added expense, but you can really target certain areas or a bigger plant or kind of more of a volume instead of having to do like a bunch of dishes or really relying on the plants working with each other. But this is just like a nice kind of boost, especially for those humidity-loving plants like calatheas and ferns and orchids and anthuriums. You just want to make sure that you're not going to point your humidifier directly onto the foliage, so it's getting wet. And sometimes, depending on if you have a cool or a hot setting on your humidifier, you don't want to stress out your leaves too much. So when it comes to misting plants, it doesn't really add a ton of humidity, and it can be kind of challenging since if you don't have good airflow and you're just spraying your plants and you're kind of relying on this evaporation to happen on the leaf, you really want to make sure that that's not staying too wet, because if it's staying too wet for long periods of time, that can eventually rot the roots, rot the leaves and introduce disease and fungi and pests. So that's definitely something that you might want to avoid, and try these other humidifying tips instead. So a few things that aren't talked about a lot when it comes to houseplant care is aerating your soil temperature or airflow. So first of all, we'll talk about aerating your plant soil. So again, like I said, it's not really talked about much, but it definitely is a really important thing to do with your plants, at least once a month before you water. So what you want to do is, since we don't have lovely earthworms that live in our soil like they do outside typically, it's good to kind of make some little pathways for that oxygen to get to your roots. So you can take your little handy dandy chopstick or your skewer that we showed earlier, and you can just kind of poke some holes into that soil, just kind of to break it up a little bit. You can also just pinch your plastic pot. If you do keep your plants in a plastic pot like this, you can kind of just give it a little bit of a pinch, a little squeeze there, and kind of break up the soil a little bit. This will help so your soil doesn't become compacted and smothers those roots over time. When it comes to indoor plants, they typically have a growing zone of 10 or higher. So that means they grow in climates like Hawaii and Florida and South America, which is, typically around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. That's still a comfortable zone for humans to acclimate to as well. So some plants that thrive in the summer months here in the Pacific Northwest, like Boston ferns are a lot of time put outside. Sometimes ficus, they really like to be out in that kind of warm weather. But once it starts to drop between like, a little like 55 degrees Fahrenheit or under at nighttime, it's time to bring those plants inside. And then also with plants that are like sitting on those windowsills, you really want to make sure that they are not getting too cold from that window, or if that window is kind of drafty, that's something to keep in mind as well during those colder months. Another thing that's not talked about as much is airflow around your plants and in your home. So airflow is an important component, so you're not having them sit in some stagnant air. In the wild, plants are subjected to some breeze and some wind. So indoor fans will help with stagnant air or hot and cold pockets of air that kind of can get built up in like corners of a room or around windows, or just stuffy rooms. If you have a room that you have a lot of plants in, it's good to keep that air moving around. So like a ceiling fan's great, or a small stationary or oscillating fan, just to keep that circulation going, is super great. That doesn't mean like you should be pointing the fan directly on the leaves and they're here created like a hurricane or something like that, but really just creating a nice gentle airflow in your space. So the best time to repot your indoor plant will be in the spring, but sometimes it just doesn't happen for whatever reason. So like sometimes in the summertime, if that's the only time you have to do it, then that works out fine. I don't recommend doing it in the winter though, since most plants aren't actively growing and some can go into dormancy. But when you do repot, you want to make sure that you don't go over 2 sizes bigger than the original grow pot. So for instance, if you have a 4-inch pot, you don't want to go bigger than a 6-inch pot. And you also want to make sure that you're using the right soil for your plant. So typically a good potting soil mix, like an indoor foliage potting mix that we have here, we carry Espoma. That's great. EB Stone is really great as well. So you want to make sure that you're using like a really good, well-balanced potting soil mix for that. And you also want to make sure that you're using a succulent cactus mix for your succulent and cacti. It will drain a lot faster. It won't hold in so much moisture, since those plants don't want all that moisture. And then sometimes you can mix a little bit of the succulent mix into your regular potting soil to increase the drainage a bit for certain plants, or if you have a pot that just doesn't have very much drainage in it. So that's something that you could do just to kind of amend your soil and kind of create like a custom potting soil. Now, if you are using a decorative cachet pot that does not have drainage in it, we do recommend that you do keep your plant in its plastic pot and just kind of plunk it right down in there. A lot of the time you're not going to even tell. I do this with all of my plants at home because I want to really make sure that it's draining correctly. If I have to repot it, it's easy. If you really have your heart set on with planting in a pot that doesn't have drainage, we do recommend using activated charcoal at the bottom, which we do sell here too. So activated charcoal is great because it will absorb extra moisture and it will inhibit the growth of bacteria. And that's why we don't recommend using like some rock down here, since it can harbor bacteria. And if you are using rock from outside, you have no idea what's living in there. So that's something that we just don't recommend. So if you really have your heart set on a decorative pot like this, for sure that charcoal will work out just great.
Okay, fertilizing. Fertilizing is recommended between the growing months between April and September, when the light is at its highest here in the Pacific Northwest. We like to use natural fertilizers, such as liquid Espoma fertilizers. They come in this nice liquid concentrate that you dilute at the recommended dosage, which just tells you all of that information here on the back of the bottle. Diluting is really important, especially when you're doing it properly. Using more concentrated fertilizer will not help your plant grow more. If you use too much, you can actually burn your plant and contribute to a salt buildup that gets into the soil and can hinder your plant from absorbing water properly. Now, if you're seeing active growth on your plant during the peak months of April through September, then once a month is a good regimen. If you do see active growth on plants during the winter months, or if you supplement with grow lights, then you can fertilize it. Just make sure that you are diluting that fertilizer even further to a lower dose. Remember that light equals food. Fertilizer is like the vitamins and minerals for your plant. Be sure to use the correct fertilizer on the type of plant that you're growing. You'll see 3 different kinds. So we have our indoor cacti succulent, and then these are for flowering plants. So indoor and cactus, they will try to promote, certain types of growth. And obviously with your flowering, you're promoting more flowers for like your African violets, your orchids, your anthuriums, sometimes your spathiphyllums. So nitrogen is really good for leaf growth, and phosphorus is really good for blooms, and potassium helps with the overall growth, with moving water and nutrients within the plants. So those are the 3 numbers that you will see on the back of here, your primary numbers. So you'll have your N, which is nitrogen, your P, which is phosphorus, and your K, which is your potassium.
Okay, so that wraps up our basic care portion for today. I appreciate you joining me on all the information I was able to share today with you. We'll be offering a sale for people who did join us for the class. The sale will be going from Saturday, November 6th through Friday, November 12th, and that includes 20% off of all of our houseplants, like for real, all of our houseplants, even including like our little cuties here, all cute, but pink princesses. We have some micans, we have a variegated string of pearls, variegated string of hearts, string of turtles, the kilo alocasias. We have a lot of different plants that here in stock, and they're 20% off. So, and then 10% off with all of our indoor pots, products such as fertilizers, tools, soil, pesticides, macrame. That will all be 10% off for that week. If you have any questions regarding that houseplant class that we just went over, or any other houseplant queries that you may have, feel free to email us at sunnyside@msn.com. Thank you again for joining me, Houseplant Holly, for our happy houseplant class. Take care!